Nintendo is arguably the most beloved video game company of all time, and with its wholesome family fun that's accessible to anybody, it's no surprise that it's a cornerstone of many people's childhoods. Its mascot, Mario, is recognized around the globe and it has worldwide appeal. And for a long time, Nintendo has had good grace with people, having a squeaky clean image. But recently, they've done some things that have people's opinions changing on this. With Nintendo's products and actions as of late, they're starting to lose the good guy image in the eyes of a lot of people. But where exactly did this start, and what have they done to erode the goodwill that they had with so many people? Profits and pricing. I remember back in the early 2000s, Nintendo was just an absolute powerhouse, with the Nintendo Wii and DS being household names. I had both. But as we move to the mid-2010s, you can see a pretty clear decline in the profits of the company. And with the failure of the Wii U during its launch in 2012, it wasn't looking good for them. And there wasn't a ton they could do. They were already matching the prices of $60 on new releases like their competitors, Sony and Microsoft, when in comparison, there were much cheaper games for the DS and Wii. There wasn't a lot drawing people to this new console, and it was a catastrophic failure when you compare it to the Wii. In the public opinion, things were still pretty good. There weren't a ton of games for it, which people had called out at the time, but there was no real ill will towards the company. But with its financial projections, it was clear that they needed to make a major change, which leads us into the Nintendo Switch, released in 2017. The Switch sold extremely well when you compare it to the Wii U. And a lot of this is due to the innovation of the console. Where the Wii U just felt like a Wii in a lot of ways, this felt like they took the idea behind the portability of a DS and combined it with the value of the home system of the Wii. So you got the best of both worlds. And this really does feel like the last true innovation Nintendo has had in the past almost decade now at this point. But at the time, this was huge. There was definitely a mentality of we are so back, especially with the games like Smash Ultimate releasing, as well as Mario Odyssey. People were loving this stuff. And I think this was really the peak of Nintendo's reputation, at least in recent times. Their latest release, the Switch 2, has been seemingly pretty successful since its launch so far. Obviously, it's going to do better than the Wii U, but at a price point of $450 compared to Nintendo Switch launch at $300, it's getting pricey for everything. Pair this as well with the controllers called Joy-Cons that can go from $80 to $100. And these consoles are getting expensive. Something also worth mentioning is for a very long time, the standard price of a new release title has been $60 from AAA publishers. And Nintendo made the decision to not only release some titles all the way up to $70, but they even have ones going for $80, which have incentivized other companies to follow suit with this. And that was definitely damaging to their reputation, seeing as they were the first ones to implement this new price hike. That was probably inevitable, but it didn't have people looking favorably on them. Also, just looking back, like when the PS5 released at like $500 and the Nintendo Switch was significantly cheaper at $300, that was a much cheaper alternative to be able to have a good gaming experience. Overall, the prices have become less consumer friendly and they've fallen more in line with other greedy companies as people have seen them in recent times. So they've lost some of the good graces being more affordable, family-friendly options. Litigation and lawsuits. Now, the price of their products is one thing, but I think that the multiple controversies they've been in this area specifically is actually what has damaged their reputation the most over the past decade or so. And this hasn't just been a continuous thing, it's been ramping up over time, and within the past week, they've made some moves that really have a wider group of people opening up their eyes and openly criticizing them. The first real action we can see that they've taken against the community was in 2013, when there were widespread copyright claims across YouTube for people playing any Nintendo games. Nintendo did walk this back a little bit in 2015, which had people initially relieved, but as we discussed with their finances, they were in a tough spot, and they were looking for ways to continue to make money. They created a partner program where up to 40% of your profits would go to them for playing. Still slightly better than their previous policy, but compared to any other company, this just was kind of ridiculous. And shockingly, people just stopped playing Nintendo games because they didn't want to lose out on revenue and give it up to them. So eventually they just walked this back altogether. There's no more policy on this in general besides just normal fair use stuff typically, but it's just kind of obvious that they've been trying to squeeze money out of people in ways that a lot of other companies have just let it slide, realizing that they get plenty of promotion just from people playing the games. And 99% of the time it's just fair use, you know, people commentating over it. And then in 2018, we saw the war on ROMs. A ROM is just basically a way to be able to play old games, and this is especially valuable when you can't get the games directly from the manufacturer anymore. And in a lot of people's eyes, this is just a good way to archive old games so they're not just lost to time. But there were a couple major sites that were distributing these ROMs, but Nintendo, claiming over $100 million in damages, decided to sue LoveRetro.com and LoveRoms.com. And this didn't even make it to court, with them winning the lawsuit for $12 million, which sent out a clear message to discourage anybody else from distributing ROMs. And legally, they're within their right to do this if people are unauthorized distributing their games, but many other companies have been much more lax on this, in the sense that you're not able to get the games anymore, so there's not really harm in distributing it, so they're just not lost to time forever. So this did damage their reputation in some ways, but like I said, they're within their right to do this, so it kind of just depends on what you think as a person. Personally, I think it's kind of scummy. I can understand if it was like newer games, but really old defunct games that you can't purchase directly from them anymore, I think those should have been left alone, and they should have just taken a more lax stance on this, where they didn't just go all in just to send a clear warning to anybody else and discourage them from doing anything similar to this. And while the 2 points I just discussed were kind of at a higher level, the next thing I'm going to talk about is a direct attack on community members. It's not uncommon at all in the gaming space for there to be tournaments or community events where people come together to play the games from these companies, and 99% of the time it's no issue at all and they just let it slide because why wouldn't they? But Nintendo, as people are increasingly starting to think, just kind of seem to hate fun, and without any real reasoning, they just like to cancel, cease and desist, tell people to stop doing these community events that would normally be no issue for any other company. The first real documented example we see of this is in 2013. They tried to block Smash Bros. Melee from being played at a charity event, but after extreme backlash, it was allowed to go through. In 2020, however, there were tournament shutdowns over mods being used in the games played at the tournaments, and they do have an extreme anti-mod stance, so I guess that's at least a little bit more reasoning in general. But then in 2022, this seems to be the most egregious example. It was announced that a Smash Bros. World Tournament championship that had been in the works for over a year was pretty much canceled overnight without any real reasoning from them, saying that they didn't have approval when this has never been an issue in the past. You know, and there were just so many better ways they could have approached it that people have pointed out. You could just give them a pass, say, hey, this year is okay with all the planning, work, all the people's time and effort that's put into it, but going forward, you need express permission. But as this has never been a problem before, it really just ruined everything and put a lot of people out of the time and effort they put in to make this event happen. Along with this, there have been direct strikes on fan games that really do seem to just fall under fair use generally and haven't even been profitable. They do have a pretty harsh stance about fan projects in general, it seems like, with one of the most popular being called Pokémon Uranium, utilizing all of its own assets, was still told to be taken down. There have also been mass DMCA takedowns across many different sites for games that weren't even turning a profit, which legally, yeah, if you're profiting off of it, then they kind of have the right to do that. But if it's a fan game and it's just for fun, it's just kind of ridiculous to be taking that down for the most part. In my opinion, I guess. You can feel about that however you want, but... And then this is kind of the most recent controversy they got into. There's a game that released to early access called Pal World. I don't know too much about the game, but I guess there's heavy crossover between the style of Pokemon gameplay as well as this one. Nintendo didn't like that. They've taken several steps into suing and patenting that just directly challenge this game from being released and made. And the patents are just actually just ridiculous. Like, they have tried to patent riding things over like a terrain or mounting, you know, like you in the Pokemon games, you can get on a Pokemon to like cross the like a river or whatever. They're trying to patent that. And not just that, also summoning other characters to like fight on behalf of you. And these are obviously slight oversimplifications, but That is the spirit of what they're trying to copyright. And most people just have no idea how this has gone through at all and has even gotten to this stage when it should immediately be strike down, because these game mechanics have been in games for the past 20 years. You know, it's insane. And overall, a lot of these lawsuits, they're legally in the right. Not all of them, but a lot of them they are. But it's just seen in so many areas across the industry that there's just some things you can just let slide, and they don't seem to be willing to let anything slide, which seems very hostile towards the community at large. Quality. The last thing I really want to talk about is the obvious decline in quality in their products as well. And the first thing I want to look at is the controllers for the Nintendo Switch, or the Joy-Cons. I have Wii remotes that are over a decade old, and besides changing the batteries every once in a while, they work great. They have zero issues to them. These Joy-Cons are extremely expensive, from $80 to $100, so you'd expect a lifespan that's on the longer side at the very least. But it's common knowledge at this point that these things are extremely easy to break, and over time, they're very susceptible to stick drift. And at $100, this just isn't acceptable. Another big blow here is Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, released in 2022. And Nintendo has really struggled in its transition from 2D to 3D Pokemon games. Upon release, this thing just performed horribly, was a buggy mess, and just screamed lazy. Even game publishers at IGN that pretty much just give a glowing review to every Pokemon game were very critical of its poor performance and direction overall. This was people's real first wake-up call to criticize these annual releases that really didn't change much in the way of gameplay or content, but were still being pumped out every year with lower and lower quality. Something I had never really questioned before until kind of recently is, you know, back in the day that they would release the 2 copies of like each Pokemon game. Like I remember, I think I got Black. There was like Black and White, and then there's like X and Y, and there's very little differences between the game. So they're really just selling 2 full-priced games that are pretty much identical. And this isn't just a problem that's specific to the Pokemon franchise, but I think this really is the one where you can kind of see the most decay and rot to what it used to be. As I also said, it's a pretty rough transition from 2D to 3D, with the graphics not looking too well or performing very well at all. And along with this, there's just obviously reused assets and animations that just come across as very lazy. This, with the hardware stagnation of the Nintendo Switch, just leads these games to performing very poorly across the board, and just not being very fun for a lot of people at their high price tags. Overall, in a lot of these cases, Nintendo has been legally in the right, but made morally questionable decisions that just go against many of the industry standards. They don't seem to have much goodwill towards the communities in general, not letting really anything slide, even when people are doing good for the community, like holding charity events. And this has kind of just given them the image of being anti-fun, when that used to be what they were all about in the first place. I also think because they're so situated in their own niche, they have no real competition. Like Xbox and PlayStation, obviously, like they're direct competitors, right? They're really fighting over the market of the same people. But Nintendo, they don't distribute their games anywhere else. They have all of their player base in one spot. There's really no need to actually innovate or change the status quo until things get into really dire straits, like with what we saw in 2014. And this kind of just lets them get away with more slop or lazy corner cutting than the other consoles, because they have the same market that they're fighting over. If one starts to cut corners extremely badly, they can just go to the other one. And overall, all of these events combined have just kind of tarnished the image of Nintendo from what it used to be. And people have now just started to see them as a profit-first company instead of one that was trying to make memorable games that people can enjoy together. Another thing people have also kind of complained about recently is they're re-releasing Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, coinciding with the announcement of the Mario Galaxy movie. And it's kind of crazy that these games are releasing paired together for $70. I saw on launch they were selling these games for like $50, and that was all the way back in 2007. So we're coming up on 20 years ago. It's almost a 20-year-old game, and it's being sold for $40 with very minimal changes upon its re-release. But, you know, at least they're not selling each single title for $70, which seems to be an issue for the newer releases. So let me know what you think, if you agree or disagree. Obviously, not everybody feels the same about this. I still think a lot of their games are great, and I'm obviously always going to be a fan of their earlier stuff. If you want to see more content kind of in this vein, make sure you leave a like perhaps subscribe. Thank you, and I will catch you guys in the next video. The hardware stagnation of the Nintendo Switch.